Thanks, Kim. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to address you at your annual conference. Can I also take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners where the conference is being held, but also where I'm coming from. I'm in Canberra, the Ngunnawal Ngambri people's country. I've got a slide presentation. I just hobbled it together this morning, probably, but obviously from previous things. So I'll try and make it as brief as I can, and also to make sure that I've been able to address it up to date. Thanks, Kevin, as well, for all the data and statistics. So it saves me doing all of that. So if I might do that, just move on to my presentation and then take it from there. Okay. Just bear with me while I try and set it up. Okay, it shouldn't take too long. Okay. I think that's it. Can everybody see that? Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll try that again. Okay, I think that's where we are now. Okay, so basically, my focus is on, I suppose it's a post-native title determination environment and developing the case for a kind of a refreshed and reinvigorated approach to self-determination through the lens and through the actions of our relationship, or lack of thereof at the moment, with the economy. So it might come as a bit of surprise to most of you, though maybe not to all of you, but we've never had a comprehensive fiscal and economic policy with the government. In most cases, historically, economics has always been seen within the context of the social deficit approach around usually just employment and training, and obviously as critically important as they are, it's not downplay the importance of that, but I'm talking about the nature of kind of the real fiscal and economic approach that government has with the broader society, broader economy. And we know that the government's current national policy framework of closing the gap, economic empowerment has always been seen within that context of mainly jobs, training and work. And we know now that since the last 80 years, each Prime Ministers of each of the political colours have stood up in federal parliament in February and basically tell us how dismal the results have been. Seems to be that the gap is widening rather than closing. So the whole issue for us is about how do we build capacity to own risk. And I think Kevin mentioned it's been 30 years since the last real major policy reform was the Native Title Act. And also now, if we just take what has already been said about the determination lands, but additional Aboriginal lands, that represents roughly about 50+% nationally, and across Northern Australia it's 80%. In some regional areas that represents close something to nearly 95%. We've also seen at the moment the change. Kevin mentioned special critical minerals and moving towards renewable green energy, and that 80%, if not higher, is likely to happen on Aboriginal lands, and we all know about the historical experiences. So we've got to change this wholesale from a transactional relationship that's happened where there are passive kind of types of agreements to more of a partnership based on equity. We seriously have got to address this question of intergenerational trauma transfer. The whole need to move towards intergenerational wealth creation and transfer. It's something that we've been working on here over the last 3 to 4 years at the ANU, and I conducted an international symposium in 2022 by a 6-part seminar series in 2023, and as a consequence of that, we produced this the Murray report and developed a community of interests. We were also looking to other international experiences and precedents that have been set. Canada particularly, because while we share similarities, I know that there is great difference in diversity, but there's certainly a lot to learn, given I think that they're about 30 years ahead of us in terms of their legal, statutory framework and the kind of institutional reforms that have taken place. I'll mention some of that later on. And as a consequence of what we formed those conferences and seminars, we've formed the First Nations Economic Empowerment Alliance, which I currently chair, and have a number of some very serious Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership with many years of experience in the finance and the economic area. And I guess the whole thing we're looking at is in this post-determination era is about what does it mean in regards to this accumulated asset base that we've now developed, and how do we go about activating these assets to the benefit of our communities. I guess there's been some criticism of that in relation to seeing this as an assimilationist approach to things, but of course this is not. Wealth generation and transfer is our entitlement, and we now have to look at how we are able to do that. The problem is, of course, we have this the lack of policy framework, and we also have very outdated architecture and very little institution support. And we also have a clear lack of understanding of what the current, economic landscape opportunity looks like at the moment. The critical thing for us, there's two key areas, obviously, and Kevin's mentioned, and already one, of course, is the question of governance and management capability and competency, and the other one, of course, is the question of capital. That's the right sort of capital, the right type of capital, and the flow of that capital. There are ongoing issues with land title fungibility, but I don't know that necessarily that's a major hindrance if we are to look at this from an economic lens on. But clearly the capability gap in terms of engaging with the local and regional and national economy is where the focus should be. I guess the mantra that I use, and I think we need to use, is that we, for whatever else where things have not arrived at, and the ongoing challenges and complexity of dealing with native title and dealing with the kind of other intra and broader political and social debate that's happening right now at the moment. And I think we have to be very conscious that we're not outside of the effective influence in terms of the geopolitical situation globally, but also how that affects our relationship with governments here. I think clearly we continue to be a minority and have very little influence on the nature of affecting government reform in critical policy areas. And we also we've failed continually because our references have always been just to the Indigenous Affairs portfolio. But what we need to do is we need to look at a First Nations finance and investment strategy as something of what we've done. Since 2023, I actually spoke to the Treasurer and said we have never had a formal fiscal economic policy relationship with First Nations communities in this country, and he was interested to know about that. And so as a consequence of that, we entered into negotiations. You'll recall that the Prime Minister at the Garma Festival, I think it was a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, 23, after the failure of the referendum, pivoted towards the nature of the economic policy. And it came as a consequence of the government making a commitment towards wanting to understand better the nature of the form of what that might look like. And so in 24, in the MyEFO, there was a decision to provide $16.9 million, and we were, that is the First Nations Economic Empowerment Alliance, together with the Coalition of Peaks, under the auspices of Treasury, negotiated a new National Partnership Framework Agreement, which was signed off in June last year. And we've recommenced negotiations in this next week actually will be our first meeting in 2026. And what we're doing is we're looking at this whole question of a First Nations finance investment strategy, looking at how we might be able to utilise government policy and instruments to improve this whole question of access. Now, most of you would be probably familiar with the government's special investment vehicles, which is something like 8 now, which represents about close to $100 billion that have been developed and aligned to have both public and private investments to underwrite the nature of government's policy. Most of you know the Clean Energy Network, the North Australian Infrastructure Fund, the National Reconstruction Fund, the National Housing Fund. All of those things are the capital available. Of course, it's by way of lowering the hurdle rate so that in fact it can attract significant kind of other institutional investors to underwrite the government's national policy position on these matters. But none of those, except perhaps for North Australian Infrastructure Facility, which there was a review, and I was a member of that review team last year. The only reference in that, in regards to its investment mandate, was around developing successful proponents, developing Indigenous engagement strategies. There was nothing concrete about the nature of identification or appropriation of a kind of capital that could be accessible to Aboriginal communities or businesses. We are caught up in this kind of bind where we still have a very, we don't have any kind of relationship. We have a developing relationship, but not very well defined relationship with private capital. So how do we kind of mobilise institutional investor capital, and where are the kind of states and territories that sit here, responsibilities? But coming back to the CIVs, I think one of the things that we're currently looking at is what, if any, responsibilities through a reconsideration of the investment mandates we should be contemplating, given that most of the threshold levels now is far beyond the kind of reach or level of the projects that might be kind of pipeline ready and for Aboriginal people to be able to access. But we know, irrespective of this, that there is a growing cohort of Aboriginal entrepreneurs and enterprises. And Michelle Evans from her unit in Melbourne, her snapshot report last year indicated that there was something like $6 billion, about 14,000 different Aboriginal businesses, and $6 billion of contribution through wages for the national GDP. So that's happening on its own. So it's not suggesting that nothing is happening. It's just, I guess, organic at this stage and fairly incremental. Incremental is not a bad thing necessarily, because they do say that incrementalism can actually kill you or can actually help to make you. Hopefully, it's the latter in our regards. So the challenge in the battle is to move the whole kind of thinking away from us being seen continually as non-contributors to the economy and as welfare mendicants. And native title has played, for whatever the history of the issues that have been associated with, it has now provided us with a foundational basis upon which to negotiate a new relationship, a new economic relationship. The question now is about how do we build that capacity and what support is required for PPCs and the other related entities that are undertaking this move towards a greater engagement with equity on their mind for projects that will be happening on the ground. This also is very much aligned to the government's intergenerational economic reform agenda. A clear example of that is the Future Made in Australia legislation. You'll recall that got through about 12 months ago, and at the same time they made amendments to the IBA Act, which allowed it for the first time to be able to access capital. So I guess if you look at the experiences of the IBA and ILSC since their inception, you'll note very much so that they were very tightly controlled by finance. So the IBA was restricted its ability to access private capital as a result of a particular clause in the Act. And you'll recall that the ILSC, prior to its amendments in 2019, could not seek to have an investment portfolio that sat outside the nature mainly of governments, directed through finance departments, without having its ability again to be able to look at mainstream investment opportunities. And of course, now that it has its own kind of a special fund under the Australian Future Fund, previously it would have been looking at government would have invested in their own bonds at about a 4% kind of level return, generally speaking. But now in its own future fund, it's anything up from 7 to 12% at times. So it was going rapidly backwards under the previous system. But thankfully, with the amendments in 2019, it's now keeping the capital is now keeping pace with the value in the marketplace. There is a critically important need to invest in PPCs and other entities that are capable of being able to build the kind of pipeline and the deal flows at the same time. And I think that's where one of our great challenges is the investment in financial literacy and acumen that comes with understanding this. And as Kevin mentioned, the opportunity is now to modernise the agreement making rather than people being seen as passive kind of royalty recipients through these mining agreements. The opportunity now is to look at a huge opportunity. The question of an example might be, for instance, there is, if you look at current trends with the major multinationals, particularly in the mining sector, they're looking to create greater efficiency in their cost structure by offloading their infrastructure to external parties. And I think there was a recent one, I think by BHP, I'm not sure what it is, a rail line in the Pilbara to a BlackRock private equity venture capital fund, US, I think one of the largest in the world. So you just an example, think about the nature of what NAIF possibly could, I'm more familiar with Northern Australia, so I'll refer to that. But just think that in its 16 years of history, there's not been one successful, well, I don't know if there's been actual applications, but investment sought from an Aboriginal interest. Yet 18 months ago, I think there was about $500 million by direct instruction by the minister to be set aside for critical minerals companies. And in that, there was no consideration of what level of potential equity Aboriginal interest could take in that. But just imagine, and I know people think that this might be premature or fairly grandiose in its thinking, but if the kind of energy transmission lines and I guess not even transmission, but generation capacity and facilities in the Pilbara, for instance, there was an opportunity to acquire if these multinationals are now offloading, if the Rio Tintos of the world or the BHPs or the Fortescue, if they're offloading their infrastructure for greater cost savings and cost efficiencies, then what opportunity is there for a collective Aboriginal or specific Aboriginal interest in relation to being able to access the appropriate level of capital so that it might become a co-investor or co-owner of the infrastructure as an alternative way other than just seeing much of their country dug up and shipped up overseas. So these are not necessarily hypotheticals, I would say. I would say what problem is we don't actually have the right architecture in place to be able to facilitate the nature of that transaction happening. And I think that's where the problem is. I just want to go quickly to Canada because I do think, as I mentioned earlier, there are some level of opportunity there. I think if we look at the 2005 Fiscal Management Act with the creation of the Financial Management Board and the Finance Authority and the Taxation Commission, it's not something we have here. So it's about time we looked at, I guess, reassessing or reinvigorating the nature of the institutional structure, the IBA, the ILSC, all those other ones, so that they're capable of being more responsive to the nature of the opportunities that are starting to emerge here. But significantly, a lot of that has to come through looking at the machinery of government and the ability to change that. So currently we are looking, there are negotiations happening between the Coalition of Peaks, the First Nation Economic Empowerment Alliance, under the auspices of Treasury, to try and see whether we can put forward some positive recommendations about a policy shift in this area. I think I've been told the time's up, so I'll stop there. Thanks.